All right, everybody, welcome back. This is The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we are talking about Margaret Atwood's 2003 novel, Oryx and Crake, which is a favorite book of Michael's, and it takes us back into the world of post-apocalyptic fiction, which I think we last visited with Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler.
That's right. It's a bit of Canadian content for our many listeners up north.
Yes, I had the honor of meeting one of our Canadian listeners recently, and it's quite exciting. It's nice.
Yeah.
It's nice to be in the presence of Canada. You know, I like Canada. I think Canada is like slightly overrated in the American imagination.
Yeah. In fact, I think the guy you met would say it's viciously overrated. Yeah.
But you know, it is still has stuff to recommend it that
that's right.
America completely lacks.
Right.
But you know, Canada's edging its way to being more like America every day. So
yeah, it's making a good bad faith effort.
Yeah. Now, Atwood is probably most well known to our listeners as the creator of The Handmaid's Tale, which was a successful, I think, did they do 5 seasons of it? It was quite long.
They did too many. I don't know what the total number was. Fuck me.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Did you watch it?
I watched some of it, and then I kind of got lost along the way.
Yeah, I thought the first couple were pretty good seasons of television. I think we probably will at some point take a look at least season 1.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I'm a huge Moss head, as you know. So
sure.
Got to watch all of Moss's endeavors. And that novel, The Handmaid's Tale, that the show was based on, came out in 1985. So
yeah,
this is kind of her 20 years later, looking back on that, but with a slightly different valence in this time. Whereas like Handmaid's Tale is like a post-nuclear disaster, nuclear war kind of sort of imposed gender trad nightmare world, right? This is also post-apocalyptic story, but in this case the sort of genesis of the apocalypse comes from bioengineering, which is a topic we touched on a little bit, I think, way back in our Frankenstein episode. You know, I think like it is something that bears watching, but
sure.
I think there's also a great deal of fear-mongering about the danger of bioengineering. And
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. I think that like it's one of those fields or spheres or spaces, I guess, that like are very confusing to toe that line between feeling conspiratorial and sort of rabbit hole red-pilled, and like, well, we are still giving a lot of faith to the people in charge of these things to not royally fuck things up, you know?
Yeah, and I think the most recent example of this is, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And the sort of debate about, was it lab leak? Was it natural genesis? And lab leak, by the way, has swung back into the lead lately. I don't know if you're tracking this.
The like origin story of COVID reminds me of, like, you know, when you go to like a baseball game and the sections have to cheer, you know, and the little, like, on the jumbotron,
like there's like a meter.
Yeah. or like there'll be 3 cars racing, and whoever cheers the loudest,
their
like the
car pulls ahead.
Zoom ahead and then come back. Yeah. And I mean, lab leak, whatever. Let's not get into it. But yeah. I think it's definitely currently in the lead.
Yeah. I mean, New York Times just put out a big story about why certain genetic markers in the virus show that it didn't, you know, that it popped up in all these different places. I'm not a scientist. I don't fully understand.
And the New York Times also falls into this category of, you'd hate to feel too conspiratorial and red pill, but you are putting a lot of faith in the paper of record sometimes.
Well, and also, I mean, remember how when COVID started, it was like the idea of it being a lab leak was presented as if it were just like completely racist, right?
Yep.
It's like, that's just your anti-Asian racism showing up. And it's like, I get it. There was ugly anti-Asian racism in the aftermath of like the initial COVID, you know, emergence, and I'm against that. But we don't want to be so anti-racist that we like ignore reality, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, this is reminding me of something like back when I was in college. I was very much into multiculturalism and like, being open to beliefs other than my own. But I like took it so far that I remember one day it occurred to me that like perhaps like the Prophet Muhammad had actually just died and not really like ascended to heaven in Jerusalem as said in Islamic traditions. And then I was like, no, that's a Islamic phobic thought, Stu. You've got to. It's like, no, Stu. Like, it's okay to like question mythology and
Right.
religious. Like, it's a kind of fine line that you kind of dance around when
Yeah.
you start thinking about these things. Um, in any case, Oryx and Crake, really good book. Really enjoyed it. I had never read it before. Tore through it in just a few days. It's not super long, but
No.
it's got a really pleasing structure where we're basically in two timelines for most of the novel. One is a present timeline where the character, the protagonist, um, Jimmy, as he was originally named, but he refers to himself as Snowman in this sort of
Hmm.
post-apocalypse era, is kind of looking at the world that he finds himself in now, which is one that has been utterly divested of human people. And needless to say, this is going to be a completely spoilers conversation. So if you're one of these,
Yeah. I mean, you've had 21 years to get a hold of a copy.
if you're one of those spoiler sticklers, give it a listen. Allegedly, they're making a TV show about this, but there's probably some reasons that might be problematic, as I'm sure we'll get into shortly.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the story has this split structure that's really pleasing to me. I really like this when there's like a character who's living their life, and then we'll periodically like dip back in to their but there's no division. Like it'll sometimes.
Yeah, it's a really good balance, and I think that the post-apocalyptic world that she builds um is only strengthened by the sort of almost minimal amount of time that you spend in it
That's
relative to many.
that's right. It's not the novel is not mostly a sort of Mad Maxian dystopia
Right.
of this like last man, or like another. I mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein a second ago. One of her other novels that we'll eventually have to cover is called The Last Man, and it's kind of similar to this book in that
Hmm.
it follows a protagonist who's one of the last surviving humans in a world decimated by plague. Good book too. Mary Shelley, uh, more than just Frankenstein. We don't wanna just um, hem her in, so to speak. In any case, yeah, what are your main interests in this book other than just it obviously fits into the theme of our show.
Well, yeah.
What's your story with it? When did you first
Well,
read
so
it?
I read it very shortly after it came out, and I've read it a couple times, but since. But I think the interesting thing this time was this was the first time I had obviously read it post COVID,
Yeah,
right? And so it's interesting, sort of engaging in all of this material that we are looking at after that like incident, sort of
after a
like
kind of close call with apocalypse that we've actually
yeah,
like lived
just a
through.
little dance, right? And like the things that I saw in the book that felt fantastical in whatever it was,
Yeah,
2005 to 2007, whenever I was reading it for the first time, um, now sound bizarrely prescient in many cases. um, obviously, I mean, you'll go through some of the story, but the Crake in the title it's a character, one of the main characters, and he brings about the sort of destruction of humanity through this bioengineering. But I'm not saying that that's what happened in the case of COVID, but it is kind of interesting to see that idea written out, and it feel not as completely divorced from my reality, if that makes sense.
right. So like when you first read this, you're like, oh come on. I mean, all right. So
Yeah,
terrorists will blow some stuff up. They'll do some terrible things. But they're not going to go this far. Like this is
yeah,
a
yeah,
little.
that's right.
And now you're kind of like,
Yeah, we're not that far away. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So just to get into the sort of structure of the pre-apocalyptic world a little bit, we see a world that's not that different from what we saw in Parable of the Sower, even before everything falls completely apart. Which is to say
Mhm.
that it's a hyper corporatized sort of democracy. It's set in the future, but not too far in the future. I mean, things have changed. Bioengineering has advanced a great deal, and class stratification has also advanced, such that
Right, but he's still like the character in the pre-apocalyptic world is still like buying a DVD player,
well,
right?
yeah. I mean, there's some funny stuff like
There's some weird, is that an anachronism? What's the word for that when it's like that
well,
doesn't feel like that would belong even in the near future that she's describing,
I don't
you
know.
know?
2003, I think DVDs were still like pretty cutting edge,
Yeah, but
right?
what I'm saying is that like Jimmy, the character who's
Y-
going around buying a DVD player, he's not in 2003. And it's
No,
funny
but I
that
mean,
like
I think she didn't have the imagination to realize people would just
that's funny to me. It's like
store everything on hard drives, right?
right.
Yeah.
It's also funny that it just like she makes up all of these sort of names for these different developments or companies or products, and it's still just a DVD player that he's getting for his house. You know?
Yeah, no, yeah, she didn't anticipate streaming.
Yeah.
She
Oh
really
no. She whiffed.
swing and a miss, strike three, you're out, Margaret Atwood. Um, no, but yeah, I mean, there's stuff like that in Parable of the Sower too, where like they have a kind of internet, but they also like no one has a phone. like there's like
Sure.
no cell phones that people are using to connect to anything. The internet's like treated like this weird hardwired thing. Yeah, I mean, this is always the danger of writing speculative fiction, right? Where
Mhm.
you're throwing yourself into a future, and inevitably some of the elements that you carry forward are things that have long since become obsolete, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, like, when did the iPod come out? I feel like that was just a little bit after 2003, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Because I feel
Yeah,
like
that's right.
it's somewhere around, or maybe it was already out, but maybe Atwood just didn't have one yet, right? Yeah, because you're right. In the 90s, we were already using like
2001 was the first ever iPod.
right, because in the 90s, I remember they had to put a block on my boarding school's like computer network because everyone was on Napster. They had to like block the domain because people were already like mass pirating.
They're like, this should take care of it.
Yeah, yeah, and we never heard about illegal downloading again. Um, yeah, there's a lot of funny stuff in this book that's like that. I mean, not a lot, just a few things. Because on other areas, as you say, she's incredibly prescient, right? Um,
Absolutely. And I think that I was like drawn more, at least the first time I read the book, certainly drawn far more to the story of the past
oh yeah,
than the
yeah.
actual post-apocalyptic
Well,
world.
almost
It
nothing happens in the post-apocalypse. It's just him
right.
taking care of these Craker creatures that we'll
Right,
talk
but
about
like
in a
you
minute.
know this again. When you're reading this in the early 2000s, or I guess mid by then. Maybe I was reading it in '05 or something like that. But it, one of the things that always stuck out was the depiction of the internet, right?
Yeah,
Why don't you explain a bit what it sort of looks like when they sit around hanging out on the computer? And
yeah. I think this is something she gets really right. So right. The main character I said is Jimmy. He has a kind of troubled home life, which we'll get into in a minute. But his best friend when he's in high school, Jimmy's kind of a clown. He's smart, but he's verbally oriented, and this is a society that puts almost no value in the humanities. Humanities
yeah,
are only valuable in as much as they can serve as like ad people or propagandists for tech
right.
companies.
Which of
Nothing.
course is eventually the job that he takes.
Yeah,
He's
and
a
that's
copywriter.
absolutely nothing like the reality that we live in now, of course. No work of no artists or writers is being exploited by tech companies. That's
Right.
unthinkable. Such a thing.
No creative person is willingly commodifying themselves. No, that's not happening.
Definitely,
Right.
definitely not. We're not doing that, in fact, or attempting to do that right now. But anyway, yeah. So he has his best friend who's called Glenn, and he's named after some obscure pianist from the past, who's of course Glenn Gould, right? And much has
Yeah.
been made of the fact that there's a sort of like Glenn Gould was probably somewhere on the like Asperger's, what used to be called Asperger's spectrum. Um,
Hmm.
and Crake exhibits many signs that he too exists as a kind of hyper focused,
Yep.
mathematically oriented, somewhat socially inept, but not to an extreme degree. And with Jimmy and Crake, he goes by Crake because that's the name he adopts in this game they play called Extinctathon. Just like, all right, Okay, it's a little on the nose, but it's like an online game that they play where and Jimmy's name is Thickney, but Thickney doesn't quite have the je ne sais quoi, right?
That's right.
Of Crake. Crake is the name of the great red crake is the name of a bird in Australia that Margaret Atwood saw on a birding trip. She's apparently an avid birder.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she made a book tour in I think the early 2000s, late 90s, for the novel that preceded this one, and
Mhm.
something about seeing this beautiful bird, like the name stuck with her, and that's where she got it from. And um, so they spend all their time doing like the most depraved stuff imaginable on the internet, right?
Yeah.
Crake is a hacker. He's got great hacking skills. So he's like commandeered his like uncle, stepfather figures like account, and so he can just use his wallet essentially to
Yeah.
buy whatever he wants, and it's disguised in such a way that the uncle somehow can't figure out where these charges are coming from. That feels a little like the first time that happened to me, I'd be like, "Well, that card is canceled." Like, right?
Yeah, that feels a little bit. I think the trade-off that I like is that while Craig is obviously a brilliant person and he ends up having this incredibly large role in the fate of the world, as it were, you don't get the sense that it's like this isn't like a Goodwill Hunting. Like the friend doesn't marvel too much about the like sheer genius of Craig. Instead, it's just like he was a hell of a great student. He went to the best school, etc. And I kind of like that you're not like constantly dealing with like his genius. It's there, but it's
Right.
not like this
No.
overwhelming element
Well,
of
in a
Jimmy's
way, I think it
life.
feels realistic, right? Whereas like Goodwill Hunting, the scene when he like does the problems on the board or whatever, and like
Yeah, yeah,
his professor's like, "I've worked on that for 30 years and could never do it."
yeah.
It's like this sort of fantasy of the precocious genius when like people who
Hmm.
are really smart and end up being really successful, it's usually a little bit more mundane, right?
Yeah,
Um, I could mention some overrated geniuses that I hate at the moment, but I won't. I'll just
sure,
leave
sure.
that in the air. Yeah, I think you're right. Like he's realistic and he's also bored, right? I think a lot of
Yeah.
what motivates them in their life is that they live within a compound because their parents work for one of the mega corporations. And these mega corporations are primarily in biotech, it seems.
Yeah.
They develop health cures for people, some of which seem to be real, others of which are scams, like very clearly, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like
And
some
I love that balance too. I love the fact that like there is still that element of like the capitalist scam of like whatever weight loss drugs or like you know
yeah, sort
ED
of like
drugs or
lifestyle improvement drugs.
yeah,
They
yeah.
feel like adjacent to like nootropics or whatever,
Right. And it's
right?
funny because it feels similar to what's actually going on, where there's like these two tracks, right? There's like there are these incredible breakthroughs in
Where it's like, oh, you
bioengineering
need a
stuff.
new liver? Well, we've grown a new liver inside this
Right.
animal for you,
Right.
and you got it.
Right.
No,
Or but then there's still like this $1 billion like take this pill and your dick's gonna get fucking huge. You know?
yeah,
Like at the same time, these two things are still going on, and she does a good job of sort of
right.
keeping
And
that.
it's also very clear that there's like nothing remotely resembling socialized medicine. All this is extremely for profit and is
Yeah.
driven, as I said, class divisions to new heights, such that the people who live in the compound and their kids are like an entirely different class of person
Mhm.
than the normal people who like work at a gas station, who are referred to as plebes, right? So it's
Right.
almost like they're an aristocracy, and the rest are these plebeians, kind of recreating this almost medieval or Roman kind of
Yeah, and
class
you know
division.
that division, which is I think really interesting in terms of how it helps the book unfold, but and sort of show Jimmy and Crakes and all of these people in the compound sort of separation from this other reality. I think it is born of the the sort of like the overwhelming dominance of like suburban development and culture at the time of like the 80s through the 2000 like early 2000s where like what this separation is that sort of there are these cities where these plebes live and it's disgusting and they have bad teeth and they, whatever else but she doesn't capture of course the like gentrification, the people who are going back into cities, and instead they get abandoned in this future, right?
Right, but I also think like there's a really good the characters who live in the bubbles in the corporate compounds are utterly delusional about what life is actually like in the cities that
Hmm.
they've left behind, right? So they think of people living in these cities as being like subhuman scum of the earth. And at a few moments in the novel when Jimmy encounters people who come from this world, he kind of has that delusion pierced a little bit. And
Yeah.
the character that primarily makes that happen is Oryx, who we'll talk about in a little bit, who's the third sort of main character in this story.
Yeah.
But yeah, they get into most horrifying. They play this game at Extinctathon. They also just watch horror videos of every kind. People squashing frogs for fun, right? Isn't that one of them? And
executions all the time.
Oh yeah, executions
obviously
are commodified and broadcast to the masses, right? And
right.
like there has to be a little struggle before, so like the prisoner about to be executed will like escape briefly and like hold off the guards for a minute before like getting strapped down and getting. It's almost like pro wrestling, right? Or something.
When I was rereading these parts of it, it sort of like it reminds me of the feeling I think that a lot of people have right now, that some of the internet and the usage of it is just becoming like absolutely like detestable.
Oh yeah.
And like the sort of like flooding with violence and sensation and sex and all of this shit that like, sure, you could always like go and search, but like now it feels like it's all sort of coming together, and like feels like a chore almost to go online sometimes,
Yeah. I mean, I think with the advent of like short form video,
yeah,
and like sensationalism of that, like we saw this a little bit 10 years ago with like Vine, right? Where like what was the dominant mode of Vine? It was like idiots doing cruel pranks on their friends and loved ones, and those were the people who got elevated to be like the Vine stars.
Right, and back at I don't know if it was the exact time or maybe it was somewhere in between, but there was also like this reminded me of the bum fights. Remember this disgusting
Absolutely.
thing
No, another friend I was talking about this mentioned that as well.
that was all over the internet.
That was like around the time that this came out.
Okay, yeah, I think that
remember
tracks.
Kimbo Slice, who was like the supposed Mr. T-esque kind of brawler.
yeah.
And R.I.P. He's passed on since then. But it was like a weird, and he was like beating up guys in a backyard. And you were like, what are we watching here?
No, it was like it was really disgusting, and this world that she builds, I think it does an excellent job of sort of showing that not only are they just incredibly bored kids, which is obviously a tale as old as time.
Sure.
I think that like the portrayal of the world that they receive has this indelible effect on someone like Crake, and sort of emboldens him as he sort of is like, why would I bother trying to save this species? Almost,
right. It gives him, it creates in him an enormous indifference towards human life and humans in general.
And that humans need to be altered. They need to, like, whatever comes next needs to fix these things
fundamentally
at a biological level,
genetic level. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing that they watch a lot of is exploitation videos. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of it too much, but it's the kind of thing you get arrested for watching, let's just say.
Yeah.
And that seems to be like rampant at this time. There's no attempt to moderate this away, which, we haven't gotten there yet. Thank goodness. But will we get there at some point? Perhaps. I mean, look at what's happened with Twitter since Elon Musk took over. There is just nonstop sexual content everywhere on Twitter.
Just like you'll see just like a normal thread, and then the first comment is just someone tweeting like porn.
Yeah.
Like fucking insane.
Oh no, don't search for anything on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because whatever your search, any trending topic will have been populated with tons of sucking and fucking videos. Yeah. And you're just like, I don't need to see that right now. Like,
it doesn't
go away.
It doesn't appear to be like I mean, I guess there are people who are like, this is bad, but it just sort of feels like, and very similar to this situation we're describing.
You just kind of become indifferent to it. You become
Yeah,
desensitized.
that's right. That's right. And
And
while I don't think that they're necessarily desensitized to the exploitation stuff, um, they're definitely open to viewing it in a way
well,
that
I
is
mean,
completely
there's
inconceivable,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
to even like one would hope. Like, I mean, certainly like at this 2003, I mean, I was in my I was what 20 years old, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would not be a thing, right? But like you can see that, we were in that moment of like beheadings.
Yeah.
Remember who,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like this actually did happen. It sort of became like a thing. And I don't
Well,
think
like
it's
the terrorists who, like that guy Daniel
right.
Pearl,
That's what I
who
mean.
was
Yeah, Pearl.
executed.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's horrifying. Like we don't need to
Yeah.
watch that, and yet now we can.
Yeah.
Uh, and they live in this compound. They're very indifferent. They're both of their family lives are completely messed up, right? Jimmy's dad is some kind of executive. I think he originally was a scientist, but by the time we meet him, he's become a sort of top guy, a VP or something in one of these companies. Initially, the company names are pretty funny. Initially, he works for a company called Healthwiser, right? And later on, he goes to work at like Rejuvenescence or something with
Right. And
sort of,
Jimmy works at like an ad company called like A New You.
I knew you, yeah,
Right.
but they're all
And like
spelled. They're all
I
spelled
love this.
phonetically.
Right. They're all spelled phonetically, but I love that they're so stupid looking and sounding.
Yeah,
Like I love it because it's like obviously they're like on the nose, but I love that development in this world of just like embracing sort of like this next level of like exploitative corporatized language
yeah,
to the point where it appears if you're reading it now or 20 years ago like to be really silly,
yeah.
you know?
Well, I mean, that's reality. I mean,
Yeah.
that's happening. I mean,
Correct.
there's no escape. Jimmy's mother, however, is very depressed about their
Mhm.
life living in this. She says things like, "Remember, we used to just like be able to like go to the beach and like do sort of normal things." And during the first 5 or 10 years of his life, she grows more and more distant, and he's left with this profound feeling like he wants to be able to please her, but there's nothing he can do, right? Like nothing he can do is ever enough to really like satisfy her. And there's a couple times when he as a kid doesn't understand something, he tries to like communicate with her and she's like, oh yeah. Plus there's also like the world they live in is always like there's like infiltrations. Like rival companies will like seed a disease in a compound to try and kill off their like stock of genetically modified pigs,
Yeah.
which they call pigoons for some
Right.
reason. And these are the pigs that you like are growing livers and you're growing a brain and for someone and you like um they eventually Jimmy's mother disappears. One day she goes to the dentist. It's all approved. She has to go into the pleblands to go to this dentist because the dentist in the compound has been fired or they're
Mhm.
getting a new guy, and she's gone. And we don't see her again really for the rest of the book. Occasionally she'll send these kind of anonymized postcards back to Jimmy, but it gradually dawns on him as he grows up that she's some kind of revolutionary, right?
Yeah.
And that she was so dissatisfied with this world that they lived in that um, she had to get out and try and destroy it, right?
Yeah, she's a very interesting character because she's such a minor part of the story, but represents this one tiny glimmer of like idealism
Yeah.
through the book.
And
And
ironically,
so
Crake likes her. Like she and
yeah,
Crake get along well, even though
yeah.
they're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum in the final
Mhm.
estimation, right?
Well,
And
I think what they can gravitate to is that they're both like men of action, as it were, right? It's like they're doing something.
they're gonna do something. Yeah.
Yeah,
They're gonna take action against this world. They both are against the world.
that's right.
Uh and the course of action they take are quite different. Crake is kind of a Hamlet figure. Uh
Absolutely.
right? Like his dad is dead when we first meet him, and his uncle has like married his mom. It's not really
Yeah,
his uncle; he's actually his dad's best friend or whatever. And
yeah,
over the course of the novel, Craig kind of figures out that the dad discovered something incredibly evil that was going on with
yes.
his company and like reported it to his buddy, his his uncle. That and then he fell off an overpass, right? Like,
Right.
and Jimmy's confused by this. He's like, was it suicide? Like, what was he doing on the overpass?
Yeah.
And Craig's
And he's
like,
like, no, not suicide.
Craig's like, hard to say.
Yeah.
He's kind of cagey about it, but it's very clear that he was murdered. Like,
Yeah.
and he clearly is gonna get revenge for this, right? Like, it's in the background. It's not like a foregrounded like Crake scheming to, but eventually we do learn that his uncle has like caught this really incurable bug, man. I mean,
how strange.
He's turned into a puddle and he just died. Yeah, there's just nothing can be done, right? And his mom also catches a bug and dies, right? So this is later when he's grown up. One thing that I noticed is that like there's a classic kind of Apollo Dionysus thing going on with Jimmy and Crake, right? Where Crake represents Apollo, the sort of god of reason, order, and, you know, mathematics, like logic. And Jimmy is more attuned to feelings and passions and like language and art, right? And Crake doesn't really see art as having any value beyond what it can do to kind of just either be a distraction or to direct people towards certain aims.
And it's an interesting part of that split is sort of Jimmy's role in the book somewhat is to be like the story of the sort of decay or limits of that part of like the person, right? So like the elements of passion or whatever that might have like swayed him to start to like engage in all of these relationships with the women that he meets throughout the book, they all eventually end up being very empty and objectifying to him, and sort of don't do it for him.
I mean, he uses his skills as an artist to manipulate women into in this very like transparent way where he's like, oh, I hold back to saying I love them until like a certain moment, and then he always is like pulling like it's not you, it's me kind of moves. Like, I don't want you to get hurt. That's why we're breaking up. Like, it's just this constant.
And then he also like gravitates to women who are unavailable. Right. But then also like when it comes to sort of the language and humanity side, like he doesn't, there's no part of this book where he was like, first I tried to write the great American novel. Failing that,
he has no
he's
ambitions.
just like, I went to a pretty shitty school and I did my thing and now I write copy for ads.
Right. So he goes to the Martha Graham, who's a famous 20th century dancer, the Martha Graham Academy, which is just this decrepit nightmare place. It's in like, it's in New York, maybe, I forget where. Like all the old cities like DC, Boston have all been like washed away by climate change at this point, right? And the cities have sprung up in their place are plebe lands, as we discussed before, and the universities are kind of cordoned off. They're like their own little bubbles, but the Martha Graham guards don't give a shit. They're like not paying attention to anything that happens. And Crake, on the other hand, goes to the Watson Crick Institute, no relation.
Yes.
And when Jimmy goes to visit him for Thanksgiving one year, it's like, anything you need. Oh, boys, do you need anything? You know, like there's like a concierge service for the students, and like,
and this is another good moment where she does such a good job throughout the book of like just sort of casually dropping the things that used to be. So she'll casually drop in a Harvard reference when comparing.
She's like, Harvard, Harvard was great before it washed away or whatever. Right?
That's right. And there's all these different moments of like that really sort of texture the book so well.
Yeah, and it's not in your face. It's just a little throwaway detail, and you're like, oh, okay, cool.
Right.
And like Hudson Bay is now like a normal place where people live, and just like Hudson Bay now is like it's pretty cold up there, right? Like might be nice in the summer, but like if you're not going to stay up there year round. And the students at the Watson Crick Institute are all getting rich. Like one of Jim Crake's classmates has created this like immobile form of chicken where it's like the chicken, it's like a chicken body, but it can't move and it just like grows chicken flesh, and it can't think. It doesn't feel pain. It's like an answer to veganism. Vegans are like, you don't care about the pain of animals. They're like, well, this animal can't feel pain, actually.
That's right.
And also, you don't let it walk outside. Well, this animal cannot actually walk. So it's like this really cynical, like it's created as this cynical rejoinder to veganism, right? And they're getting rich. By a little later in the novel, we see their franchises of this fake chicken stuff everywhere, right? And like,
Yeah, I mean the whole realm of bioengineering and genetic modification has become like seemingly the last remaining growth industry,
that's right.
right?
That's right.
And that's
And
another interesting sort of development that instead of like startup app tech culture, this is designed more of on like applying. It's less theoretical. It's more about applying science to the actual world, not the online world.
yeah, yeah, no, well
Because
said.
largely the internet feels very similar to the internet that existed in 2003 or exists sort of now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Whereas you're walking around with pigoons who are developing who can, house six kidneys,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you take them out and they can regenerate them. Like that seems to be where, you would go to Shark Tank and be like, I got a pig and he can churn out the kidneys, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
Mark Cuban's like, I'm fucking in. Okay, I can distribute this. I
Okay,
got a
sharks,
connection.
imagine this.
Yeah.
Like, so we should probably talk about the other main character, Oryx, right? Who kind of
Yeah, so she sort of comes down the middle, right?
yeah, and Oryx is interesting because they first encounter her, or at least Jimmy believes he encounters her in one of
Mm-hmm.
these exploitation videos when she's very young and she's living
Yeah.
in she's of Southeast Asian heritage. Jimmy's never able to discern which country she's actually
Mm-hmm.
from. And he actually has this printout of this face, this image of her face from one of these videos
Yeah.
that he keeps throughout his life. It's like folded up secretly in one of his books or something. And she eventually comes to work for Crake at his final compound where he's developing these creatures who are called the Crakers, right? I guess we should talk about the Crakers too. So, at the end of the novel in the post-apocalypse, Jimmy is living amongst these new humanoids called Crakers, who are
Yes.
like human-like but more perfect. And
But also, it should be said, not quite among. He's sort of separated. He has his own little setup, right?
But he's kind
Because
of
he can't like deal with the strength of the sun, so he has to build shade, whereas they can function in whatever the normal way that they now function, right?
yeah, they're adapted by design to the harsher environment of
Mm-hmm.
post global warming world. They are also very docile, but they don't have a lot of conflict with each other. But they have certain pheromones that prevent them from being easy prey to animals and other creatures. Right? The men they mate in a sort of
A non-competitive way.
and in a cycle. Right? It's like a certain time
Yeah.
of the month. The men go into heat, the women go into heat. It happens. There's no like courtship,
Right, and the
or
way that
anything like
they get rid of the competition by a group of men will always have sex with one woman,
so you never know who the father is.
who the father is. Yeah,
So no more Hamlet problems, right? Eternity is over. And they're also they don't see race, to quote Stephen Colbert, right? And they are of all different colors and shades, and it's just kind of at random. And basically, when Crake creates these people, he presents them as though they're like this perfect model child that a potential customer of his company can come and see and be like, oh, I like that one. Like, I want our son to have like that skin tone and like that muscle. He calls them the floor models for these
yeah,
future genetically engineered children. Much in the way that when you go into a furniture store, you're like, oh, this couch is pretty nice. Yeah, get me one of these, right? Except instead of in this case, you're choosing your future bioengineered child. This is a lie, though. This is just this is the fiction he's created to enable him to create these people. And he's so successful and powerful at this company that he has carte blanche to do this. He's also able to hire all of these kind of biohackers that he met in the Extinctathon game when they were growing up. And these are people that were kind of bioterrorists who were doing things like creating a rat that eats concrete and like releasing it in certain areas, right?
right. And like it kind of feels like they are brought into the company sort of in the way that like a great hacker might end up working for intelligence.
Absolutely, 100%. and it feels almost like The Matrix or something, right?
Hmm.
I wonder if Margaret Atwood had watched The Matrix. Probably, she probably saw it 6 times in the theater. Who are we kidding? What late 60s-year-old Canadian legendary
Yeah.
author didn't do that? Eventually, Oryx though is somehow found by Jimmy. I think he meets her through the kind of concierge at his college by showing them a photo of her, the same
Hmm.
photo that Jimmy has. Crake does this rather, and they find her and like bring. She's emigrated to the United States. She,
Or at least we're led to believe, sort of, that we know for sure that it is the same
right, it's
person.
never confirmed, but
It's never
For
confirmed, and
Jimmy,
I love that part of it
I
too,
do
right?
too. Like it doesn't matter. She's someone who's very similar to the person from the photo.
Yes.
Her backstory we eventually learn. She grew up in a rural village. She's the example of a character who like grew up outside of the bubble and has somehow made her way into the bubble.
Yeah.
And she's done this through sex work essentially,
Hmm.
but also because she's smart and she's kind and she's really good at working with uh, these Crakers, these new humans who are very curious about everything and essentially have no framework for the reality. And one thing I really love about the novel is we we learn about Oryx. Oryx eventually has a relationship with Crake, but she's also sleeping with Jimmy. And Jimmy at this point
Hmm.
has been brought into this project to be the kind of head PR guy, right?
And
And
Jimmy is, it's interesting because like you get the sense that Crake cares for Oryx. You get the sense that Jimmy is in love with, or at least very infatuated with Oryx.
definitely,
And you also don't know for sure if Crake knows what's going on with Jimmy and Oryx,
you
but
have
you
to
don't.
assume that he does, right?
Yeah, but you're left to assume.
Yeah.
It's not, there's not really that sort of outward knowledge presented in the book.
No, no. A lot of stuff is left like that. And Oryx is one thing I was really struck by is that like Oryx describes her own education, how she was like sold from her village by her mother
Yeah.
because her father died, and that this was a traditional thing that happened. She went off to the city with this uncle character
Hmm.
who initially just had her selling flowers. Eventually, he kind of used her to shake down sex tourists.
Yeah, so she was very small and young looking when she got a little older, and then she what she would do is basically she would entice men to get into a sexual situation, at which point the uncle would charge in and shake down the piece of shit who was about to do something terrible.
That's right. And eventually, she comes to America because, or North America, because someone's like, this creepy old guy is like trying to save girls like him. But it's like
That's right.
again, it's very ambiguous because she's like, no, he wasn't so bad. Jimmy's like, I want to strangle that guy. I want to kill him. She's like, Jimmy, you're ridiculous. Like because of him, I'm here. Like he saved me. Jimmy has these kind of like highfalutin chivalric notions of love about her, and she's much more like pragmatic. Right? She's just like,
Right.
look, like
And
sometimes.
like again, like to speak of the ambiguity of it, which is I think particularly powerful in the treatment of Oryx, where it's like you can't quite tell whether there's like a degree of Stockholm syndrome with her description of why she appreciates this person
These
who was like,
exploitative creep
yeah.
people.
Or is it like just sort of the theme of like, well, you guys are in your own form of prison in this compound, and your
Absolutely.
reality is
Yeah.
shaped by all these people. And so was mine. And she kind of takes on this fascinating, like transcendent role of like she doesn't she's very cagey and like not like hyper descriptive about the life that she lived, but she also like it's like she has emotionally processed it in a way that Jimmy hasn't. And Jimmy's kind of white knighting a little bit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so they carry on this affair. Whether or not Craig knows about it is unclear. But one day, Oryx is like, I'm going to go get some pizza. I'll see you back in a little bit. She's been working to educate the Quakers. She's almost taken on a kind of divine role for them.
Yeah.
They're housed at this point in a like bubble dome where they're protected from the outside world. And she kind of can sneak in and appear, and she teaches them about animals. She gives them lessons about surviving in the outside world. They have a lot
Mhm.
of questions. They don't understand anything. And as I was saying, like they are very clearly paralleled. Their education from her is paralleled with her education that we see in her flashback portions of the story,
That's right.
where she like doesn't know about the world. She's in this village, suddenly she's in the city, then she's even bigger city, then she's in this next place, and it's like you're like, oh, it's just really skillfully done because it's subtle and it doesn't like jump out at you, but you're like, got it, nice, like, and it kind of just points us to how, like you were just saying, like how much of our reality is made up of these kind of constructed fairy tales that someone has told us and that we accept, and we accept it for so long it becomes the only reality. When we see something that deviates from it at all, it's shocking and it's
Right, and also
unbelievable.
And also that the type of exploitation that someone like Oryx experiences is so like visually and viscerally wrong, and whereas the sort of like softer exploitation that you undergo living in a world where you're not experiencing such physical threats can also lead to a similar collapse of the self or society, right?
Yeah, and that like a world that people like we live in, New York in America is inevitably built atop maybe not as extreme forms of exploitation as what Oryx does, but you think about the people making iPhone screens in
Right.
China and
Right.
things like this, right? That we all accept some level of this kind of exploitation into our lives,
Right.
and that people like Oryx who actually experience that sees it in a different way. Again, not saying this to justify exploitation or anything like that,
Sure.
but just to sort of the way that it explores.
Well, it's just a comment on the limits of experience, right?
Exactly.
The limits of perception, like
Right.
what you can actually relate to versus what you want to think you can like really relate to,
Yeah.
It's
like, no, I
it's
get
difficult.
it, man. Right. And this comes up in areas like race. It's like, no, I'm an ally, man. Like, I get
Yeah.
it. I may not have experienced it, but it's like,
Yeah.
go away. Right?
Yeah.
Like you see this manifesting in a lot of areas in life, and it's such a smart way of depicting it. And again, it's very subtle. So turns out Crake's floor models are actually the new humanity, right? He's eliminated. He's going to kill everyone on Earth, and he's done this by this new pill he's designing that's called Bliss Plus, which is essentially a kind of sterility pill that like gives it like it's like a population control mechanism, but that like promises like reward. So like you'll feel great if you take this. It'll make you sterile, but that's fine because you won't want to have sex anymore. You won't want to, right? Like,
yeah.
And unbeknownst to those who've taken it, it's also seeding a time delayed like hemorrhagic fever that makes Ebola seem like child's play.
In that way, astonishingly similar to the COVID vaccine. Right.
Well, to the conspiracy theories about it.
I think it might just be, right?
Yeah, it's very. This episode's now going to be demonetized. And
well, no, but what I'm saying is you see that now when whenever anybody like aged 50 dies, you'll see somebody on the internet be like,
died suddenly.
Vaccine, huh?
Were they vaxxed? Yeah. No, died suddenly was the documentary about this.
Right.
It's like one of the player collapsed and it was suddenly like, or even Damar Hamlin when he had that.
Oh yeah, the Buffalo Bills player.
Right.
He became this like weird cultural
people were claiming,
lightning rod.
People were claiming he was a clone. Right, that they'd replaced him with a clone.
Right.
They were doing things like the tattoo on his arm doesn't match up in this photo from then.
That's right.
It was like absolute madness. Right, and we learned from Crake, the reason Crake's dad was killed was that he discovered that, in fact, when you cure all the diseases, that's a problem because you don't have anything to sell. So you know what you got to do?
Yeah.
Create some more diseases, right? So that these bioengineering companies have essentially been doing this on a minor scale all along. Now, they haven't created a horrible plague that kills everyone, but Craig's like, well, let's take it up a notch. And he actually has Oryx go out as his rep to all these places and sort of distribute the pills, right?
Yeah.
And weirdly enough, though, he has a vaccine that he's made for the illness, and he's given it to Jimmy. Yeah. And it's unclear why he doesn't give this also to Oryx, or whether he took it. Presumably he took it himself, but
don't know.
So Oryx goes out this one night to get pizza, And a few minutes after she's gone, these bulletins start coming in.
Yeah.
It's like New Orleans, mysterious illness swarms over city. Oh, Taipei, like, and it's just
Right.
like, and it's like at slightly different times, right? It's like one day it's here, and the next couple days it's here, and Jimmy is
Right, but it's also important to note that in this process, Crake has told Jimmy, if I'm not around, you have to take over the project.
well, and Oryx has actually said that as well. Oryx is
They
like,
both say it, yeah.
Oryx is like, you're gonna have to, um, take care of the Quakers, right?
Yeah.
So,
And that part is pretty clear foreshadowing when it happens. You're like, okay,
yeah.
now I'm understanding where we're going with this. Yeah.
Right, because it's also clear that Oryx is vaguely aware that something fishy is happening too.
Yeah.
Right. And the kind of moment of the story that's most interesting is Jimmy's panicked. He's like, why isn't Oryx back? The pizza should be ready by now.
Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit.
Yeah, exactly. And then he tries to call Crake, and Crake's like, I'm at the pizza shop. It's fine. He seems wasted for some reason.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, for some reason, he knows what's going on.
He just started the literal genocide of all of humanity.
I'll take the bullet rye, like fucking may as well.
Yeah, and he comes back some hours later, or he talks to Oryx briefly, and she tells him like it's all the places that he sent me. Like,
yeah,
and so he has the light bulb. Oh my God, I know what's happening. Mm-hmm. And Crake finds her at the pizza shop, presumably, and she's sick. It seems like she's dying. Maybe she's already dead. And he's like, Jimmy, let me into the bubble dome. Because, Jimmy is safely sealed in with the Quakers. And he changes all the locks immediately, because it's the first thing he's supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has this choice to make. Like, is he going to let Crake in? Like, of course, the Quakers are probably immune to this. Like, they were built by the guy who built the virus, blah, blah, blah. And he sees that he sees that Crake has Oryx. So he, lets them in, and Crake immediately gets a knife and slits her throat.
Yeah.
Which is like, and then Jimmy responds by just shooting him and killing him immediately. And they're just, left dead on the, vestibule of the biodome. Like, he can seal, and they were just, left there. And over the next weeks, he kind of follows the media as, newscasters die on air, and, after a while, every signal goes black. There's, almost no one is left alive in the whole world, it seems. And he's just kind of like, is this even real? He starts to kind of go crazy. But whenever he doubts...
Kind of.
Well, yeah.
I mean, how could you not?
Well, whenever he starts to doubt his reality, he goes and looks at their bodies to confirm that, they're actually there, they're dead, this did happen. He also very skillfully, kicks out all the hackers. He's like, no, you guys should go back to your quarters.
Yeah, take a bit of time off.
And eventually, it seems like everyone in the world is dead, so he, leads the Quakers out into the world. And now all the genetically modified pigs are running wild. They can think because of all the modifications they've evolved. They're a menace.
And you don't know what's so cool about it is you don't know if he's unwittingly following Crake's plan, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he is.
I mean, one would think, but
I think he's aware of it. He knows that this is what Crake would have wanted him to do on some level.
On some level, right?
He creates Crake as the kind of god for these people. Oryx and Crake then become the twin deities, right? Where Oryx is the god of the animals, and the Quakers should never kill an animal because that would upset Oryx. And then Crake is the creator, which he literally was. He did create these people. But they treat him like a god, and he is kind of put in the position of being the Moses or Prophet Muhammad or Jesus.
That's right.
He's the mediating figure who kind of delivers the lore. That you get the sense immediately that the Quakers are already building on the lore, right? They're we prayed to Oryx, and she said we don't have to worry about that anymore. And he's like, you did? Okay.
Which is I think to me probably my favorite part of the book, right? Is this confusing element of Crake and what he set out to do and what he wanted is all very ambiguous, ambivalent, right? It's on the one hand, it's he is brilliant enough probably to know that would take place.
And that Jimmy would kill him if he killed
Right.
Oryx in front of,
Right.
right?
But presents himself as sort of like fanatically anti-religious and anti-art and anti-humanities, but he sets up a world where Jimmy, being the mediator, is only going to help the Quakers along with their new apparent like religious sentiment, right? And so like then you're just like, wait, so like is that like did Crake actually want to become God? Because why would he have gone through this whole process if not to end up as the deity, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, but again, like the strength of the book is like, that's never really made clear. It's like he doesn't get Crake's manifesto that's like, and then I become a god or anything like that
exactly.
at all.
I mean, Crake is great because he's a monstrous villain, but he's not a mustache twirling, like,
that's right,
like hubristic, typical, like,
right. And I think that one of
the
strengths of the dual storylines where you're seeing the world fall apart and you're seeing Snowman in the future seeing what still exists and trying to keep the pieces together or stay alive, that like you're never really actively cheering against Crake as villain in a typical sense, right? You don't get the same feeling of like, oh, there's a ticking time bomb and if only Jimmy can get there in time or write just the right copy.
It's so out of Jimmy's hands, right?
That's right.
Like Jimmy is only piecing it together retroactively, and there was really no way or no obvious point where he could have got.
I mean, that's sort of like that. Like that to me is sort of the overall theme that has stuck with me for like the 20 years that I've sort of come back to this book. There's this quote, sort of almost like a throwaway quote in the book that where he says to Jimmy, "We're in a speed tunnel. When the water's moving faster than the boat, you can't control a thing." And I think this is like something that is sort of, it's perfect for the book and the way that the post-apocalyptic world develops, and Jimmy becomes Snowman's sort of like hapless form of influence but total lack of control. And yet at the same time also sort of applies perfectly to our current condition, the sort of feeling that all of these things, all the things that we talk about in the podcast, are AI is the perfect example of the moment, right? This feeling that these things are moving faster than our ability to, whether it's something as simple as legislate for or against something,
or like social media, like
right, or the way that like
now they're doing regulations on social media. It's like, oh, now, like,
right, but even
not
beyond
20 years ago,
right,
like,
even beyond the strictly regulatory, the way that you learn that your brain isn't built for social media, and you're finding that out while you are becoming addicted.
Well, you're finding that out
like,
via social media, right? Like,
right, exactly, and that whole sense of everything that has happened, in the, let's just loosely call it the sort of like tech revolution.
Yeah.
And this is obviously also part of the human condition for all of recent history, right? Industrial revolution, like all of these big changes that the individual human is increasingly more powerless to feel any sense of control over their own life. And that to me is sort of like encapsulates why the ambiguity that she chooses is so perfect, because it applies to the future, the post-apocalyptic world. It applies to the sort of near future origin story she has, and it applies to the time in which she was writing the fucking book,
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, you could even see this with like throughout human history, right? Once upon a time, we were subject to these sort of whims of these powerful individuals, right? Be they ancient times chieftains, and then eventually emperors, kings, like that. And now it's almost as if those people themselves are also kind of caught up in the right. Yeah. It's like there's a president. Is the president that powerful? It's like, well, yes, in many ways, sure, but it also feels like, well, there's nothing the president can do because you sort of like legislate one thing, another thing's already taken, right? And like
right, and in the sphere of like AI, the people who are building it are like, well, I'm not sure how this is going to go. Well, it's going to be really bad.
Yeah. Better. Oh, this isn't good enough. We got to release the next one and the next one and the next one. Right? It's just like this weird. It is like the speed tunnel where the water is like faster than the boat. Right. Where we're just like snow getting off. There's no turning. There's no like
Yeah.
the tunnel only goes one way. Like, I look. I thought this novel was great. I think it's really prescient about the dangers of technology and the internet, and I think it is really interesting to read it, even if it doesn't parallel COVID exactly. There's enough similarity there that you're like,
yeah. And I think the last thing that I would say that because ultimately, this is a work of art and speculative fiction, I think that one of the things I really like about it is placing Jimmy there. And I mentioned this in the notes of the episode that, like, he says that the arts and humanities are pleasant to contemplate, but no longer central to anything. And
that's what Jimmy says, or is that what Crake says to Jimmy? Like,
oh yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it might be Crake, but it's the sentiment is like it makes me think
it's
about
hitting a little close to home there, right?
it's also just, it just feels like it feels pretty much accurate, unfortunately. I mean, like, I'm not saying that there's no value in these things, right? But like, it sort of reminds me of the weird, like, piece to the Trump era, where there were these people who were like, well, one thing we know for sure,
so we're gonna get
a lot of great art because it's so crazy. We're gonna get so much great art in the Trump era. I'm like, what did we get? Young Sheldon? Like, what are the like landmark moments of the Trump era?
Did I tell you about my pitch? It's called Younger Sheldon. Yeah,
but it's like comedian, it's like stand-ups being like, we need comedy at a time like this
now more than ever, right?
Now more than ever. Yeah.
One thing, Noam Chomsky didn't die. We thought he died, but he's unwell. He has this great interview with the American Prestige Pod that I listened to from a couple years ago, and he says he's kind of troubling the notion of speaking truth to power, right? Mm-hmm. How like, the great role of the artist is, and he's like, you don't need to speak truth to power. Like, power is fully aware of the truth, right? like they know what they're doing. It's not like you're gonna create a like light bulb moment for like Saddam Hussein or Donald Trump or Stalin or Putin or whatever, right? Like, these people are fully cognizant of the like contours of what
it's not going to be like, wow, the next George Carlin really broke through into the halls of power.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, the people at Raytheon were like going to make this like ultrasonic missile. But then someone during COVID wrote King Lear. Remember that one too? That was also Shakespeare. Yeah. Did you guys know Shakespeare during a plague? Yeah. He's quarantined. Wrote Lear. Think of all the Lears we're about to get, guys. As if like the only like valuable aspect of Shakespeare writing Lear was that it was a quarantine, right?
Yeah.
Ingredients for King Lear: quarantine. That's it. Right? Like. Anyway, yeah. I mean, great book. Really, one of my favorites that we've done, and I thank you very much for encouraging us to cover it, Michael. We'll have to pay another visit to the land of Canada soon, but for next week we have something that's a little closer to home.
Yeah, next week we are taking a look at the Trump era, as in now, and the potential for the continuation of the Trump era. We are actually going to try something different on the podcast. We are going to watch, as I'm sure many of you will, one of the two very early this time Trump-Biden debates, and we're going to watch the debate, and we're going to do a couple things. We're going to obviously talk a little bit about what I'm sure will be a glorious few hours of television, but also I think will be fun is that we will sort of dive into some of the hypotheticals that you hear, some conspiratorial, some less so, about sort of what might happen if, when it comes to the election. As you know, there's a lot of paranoia about the complete end of democracy or political violence and all of this stuff. And I think we're going to take a look at the sort of
dictator for a day talk.
Right. So we'll
Operation 2025 or Project 2025 or whatever.
That's right. So I think we'll split the episode basically into one, a sort of commentary of the debate itself and any moments that take place, but then also look at what people's fears seem to be and whether they are grounded or otherwise.
And this will be like real back to our roots territory, because I remember like a month before the 2016 election, we're sitting in my car outside of a sports bar after watching basketball, and you're like, is this really gonna happen? should Hillary really be saying that? What if Trump wins? Isn't there gonna be, so this is and then we watched the election together in 2016. Both both went home early.
Yeah,
little dispirited.
Yeah.
Not that, I mean, we weren't like fully in our pantsuits or anything. We weren't just like Hillary.
No, it was
stands.
like the inverse. It's like the inverse of the Jaylen Brown. For any Celtics fans out there listening, like the energy has shifted. It definitely felt. It's like somewhere in the night, the energy shifted in such a remarkable way. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too. Walk down memory lane a bit. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
And until then, please feel free to share the pod with a friend. Subscribe. Please follow us on Instagram at End of the World WMS. And until next week, this has been the End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I am Michael.
I am Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.